Welcome to the Animal Law Podcast. This is Marianne Sullivan, and today I'll be speaking with Bill Eubanks, an incredibly articulate and experienced environmental lawyer, and he's with the firm of Meyer Glitzenstein and Eubanks, and he'll be talking about this case involving a pair of bald eagles who are trying at this very moment, as we speak, to raise their recently hatched chicks in Colorado, and the legal question of whether the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, a statute about which I knew nothing before I spoke to Bill in this interview, is going to protect them from some very nearby development that could actually threaten the lives of these chicks. So before we get to that interview, I'd just like to quickly remind you that Running Our Hen House, which produces this podcast along with the Our Hen House podcast, is it's an act of love. We love doing it, but it does mean that we have to ask for your support. And if you can, go to ourhenhouse.org/donate, and you can join our flock, which is our special group of supporters, or you can make whatever donation you could afford and are comfortable with. But if you can, it would really help keep animal-friendly indie media going. And we would really, really appreciate it. But now to Bill Eubanks. Bill joined what is now Meyer Glitzenstein and Eubanks in 2008, and he practices in the area of federal appellate and trial court litigation under the Endangered Species Act and many other federal statutes involving animals or involving the environment. And he's worked on cases that have challenged oil spill response strategies harming sea turtles, getting protections for Indiana bats from an industrial wind energy project, obtaining agency records regarding federal financing of coal-fired power facilities, forcing a reconsideration of critical habitat for the California tiger salamander, reducing off-road vehicle use in Big Cypress National Preserve, all such important work protecting animals and the environment. He also teaches. He teaches at Vermont Law School, American University's Washington College of Law, and at the George Washington University Law School. He teaches the same course at all of these schools, which is, it examines the intersection between environmental law, food systems, and agricultural policy. So that sounds like a really great course that I would love to take. Anyway, he also he's written loads and loads of articles in his areas of expertise, but I'll just point out one book he co-authored and co-edited, Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Law. And I'm really excited to be talking to him today about this case that is seriously going on right at this moment. Welcome to the Animal Law Podcast, Bill.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you. I've been looking forward to talking to you because you are part of the extremely prestigious firm of Meyer Glitzenstein and Eubanks, and always doing exciting cases. And another thing that I really wanted to talk to you about this particular case, I really know nothing about this statute, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act that we're going to be talking about. I am old enough to remember when we almost lost the bald eagles, but I don't know that much about the law. Can you just give us a general picture about what led to this statute and basically what it requires?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, which those of us in the wonky world of attorneys who practice this statute and the regulations under, we call it BGEPA.
Yeah, I was afraid of that.
Yeah, so if you hear me say BGEPA, that's what I'm talking about. I may also call it the Eagle Act, which probably is a bit easier to digest. But so for many years, as you alluded to, the bald eagle was in pretty dire straits, and so it was listed under the Endangered Species Act. About a decade ago, it lost protections under the act because it had rebounded in certain locations throughout North America. And so once it lost the protections of the Endangered Species Act, the fallback, one federal law that's in place that is specifically directed at eagles is the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. And so that law has been on the books for a while, but during the time when there was an Endangered Species Act listing, it was less necessary from a practical standpoint because the Endangered Species Act provided such important protections. Now that is no longer filling in the gaps, BGEPA has once again become a more important tool for addressing both bald eagles as well as golden eagles, and looking at things both from an individual standpoint as well as from a population standpoint. And I can talk more about that. In terms of what it does, it's a fairly basic statute. When you read the statutory provisions, Congress set forth a prohibition against the take of bald and golden eagles unless authorized to do so by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So in certain respects, it actually does mirror the Endangered Species Act, except again, it only applies to the two types of eagles, bald eagles and golden eagles. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has promulgated regulations under BGIPA that sort of fill in those gaps that the statute is silent on. And under those regulations, there are a number of findings that Fish and Wildlife Service has to make before it can issue a permit that would take eagles. And take is pretty broadly defined. It includes everything from lethal take, which would be death of an eagle, all the way down to various forms of, nest disturbance and other types of harassment that would interfere with an eagle's essential biological functions, so their foraging or their reproduction. And, so that's sort of the general overview of how the statute works. In practice, there are a couple different types of permits that an applicant can seek. So there are, nest disturbance permits, which we'll be talking about some today. That type of permit actually kind of falls under what we refer to as incidental take permits, meaning that it's not the purpose of the activity to harm eagles, but it will nevertheless result from that action. And so, again, similar to the Endangered Species Act, for folks who are familiar with that, under Section 10 of the ESA, there is an incidental take permit program or ITP process that an applicant can apply for a permit from. The same type of activity is regulated under BGIPA and its regulations. And so, in many respects, again, it sort of mirrors or is similar to the ESA. But again, it is only directed at bald eagles and golden eagles. One quick caveat I should say before we move on to other questions is there is a different statute that's not at issue in the case we're going to be talking about today that does provide additional protections for eagles, and that's called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the MBTA. So sorry for acronym soup here, but that is the MBTA is much more broadly applied because it applies to all migratory birds. So that includes, eagles as well as many types of songbirds and other, migratory birds throughout North America. And so that's based on a convention from 1918, which the United States signed as a treaty with other countries, sort of in the American corridor, Canada, Mexico, and others. And so, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, again, it's not something we're going to be talking about much today, but it does provide some additional and supplemental protections in addition to the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act.
So I have a couple of follow-up questions. In the first place, is take is not defined exactly the same as in the Endangered Species Act? Is it broader?
It's more specific to eagles because unlike the Endangered Species Act, which applies broadly to any, plant or animal species that is listed as threatened or endangered, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act is specifically directed at only eagles. And so the definition of take, while broad, is sort of focused on the types of behaviors and other functions that are carried out by eagles specifically. And so, I think in some ways it's less a question of are they the same or are more stringent. It's that they're more specifically directed from a biological standpoint to the species that are protected by the statute. I will say that the Endangered Species Act does, have a term called harm. And harm has not only a regulation that's been defined by the Fish and Wildlife Service as to what harm means, but there's also been a lot of litigation on that issue. And so, harm has been, become kind of a statutory provision in and of itself. There is no similar provision in the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act that has received that kind of scrutiny, either from Fish and Wildlife Service or from the courts. And so, it's sort of hard to say at this point in time because BGIPA has been much less litigated, whether or not, they're exactly the same, but a lot of the protections are quite similar.
And another thing I was intrigued by was you just alluded to the fact that it protects eagles in both an individual capacity and population capacity. Could you just expand on that a little bit?
So there are, So the way that the statute works, I mean, take is strictly prohibited without authorization from the Fish and Wildlife Service for any purpose whatsoever. And so that's sort of the individualistic aspect of it. That applies to, an individual bald eagle, male, female, or eaglet, a young eagle that's been born in that season. And so it sort of, that's where I would say that the take prohibition is focusing on individuals. However, there are some findings that are built into BIGIPA's regulatory scheme, which is administered by the Fish and Wildlife Service, that also focuses on populations. And so, for example, there are findings that have to be made before any permit can be issued under the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act that force the Fish and Wildlife Service to analyze cumulative effects and also other permits in the region that have been issued to take eagles. And so, kind of a practical example of that would be if you, let's say within, a particular region, say a radius of 30 miles, there are only a couple of nesting bald eagle pairs. Fish and Wildlife Service has already issued several other permits that allow those eagles within that area to be taken. Then, having another permit come in addition to that might be too much. It might be something that could cause all of the eagles in that regional population to abandon their nest and to move to other locations. And so it's that's kind of where the requirement stems from for Fish and Wildlife Service to focus not only on, take of individuals, but also how will this impact the regional population.
I see. That makes total sense. And now one further follow-up question, which is just because of my own ignorance here about eagles, but what is their migratory habits? Where do they go? And where do they come back to?
Well, that's a great question, and the answer is despite a lot of research that's been done on bald eagles in particular over the last half century, we know a lot, but we also still don't know a lot. And Fish and Wildlife Service, as the expert federal agency, works closely with its state counterparts, state wildlife agencies, to try to figure out the specific migratory patterns of these birds within particular states. But the fact is, it's very site specific. So what a bald eagle might do in Northern California is very different from even what a golden eagle might do in Southern California. And even between bald eagles, the ones in Colorado exhibit very different types of behaviors and very different timing on their migratory patterns than what you see on the East Coast. And so I'm certainly, although I work with a lot of scientists on these issues, I will not even attempt to get into the very complex and nuanced world of bald eagle migration patterns and other biological functions, because they really do vary from place to place.
I had no idea I was asking a hard question. I thought I was just being stupid, but apparently nobody knows the answer.
Yeah, I mean, there are answers, but again, even so, this case that we'll be talking about today is within the state of Colorado, and even within Colorado, I mean, part of what's been difficult about this case is both the federal agency, Fish and Wildlife Service, and then the state agency, Colorado Parks and Wildlife. They've gone back and forth on what would be appropriate mitigation measures because, this particular pair of eagles is the only one in the entire county. And this is a large amount of space in this one county. And the behaviors they've seen from eagles 2 or 3 counties over, which is not that far in the scheme of things, those behaviors have been quite different than what's happened with this pair of eagles. So it's not something you can just kind of say, well, if we're seeing this in one place in Colorado, we can extrapolate it elsewhere. You really do have to do your research on the particular, eagles that you're focusing on.
That is so interesting. So tell us about, we are talking about individuals in this case. Tell us about the particular eagles at issue here.
Yeah, so the eagles that we're talking about is a nesting pair of eagles. It's a mated pair. They've been together for many years, and they have been in this nest since the early, so about 2011, we think is when the nest was established, 2010 or 2011. We know that it became very quickly a nest of public interest. There are a lot of people in the area who go out on an almost daily basis, if not every single day, to check in on these eagles. Obviously, they're watching them from afar. They don't want to disturb the eagles. But they have been, they built this nest many years ago, and they have a few other nearby, nest. This is sort of their primary location. It's right by a place called Stearns Lake, and it provides a great opportunity for foraging for them because there's a prairie dog colony only a couple of 100 feet from the nest. And this nest is up in a mature cottonwood tree. The nest is located 60 feet off the ground, and so it's a great perch for these raptors, these bald eagles, to be able to scan the environment and find their prey that then they can, bring back up to the nest, especially when they've had young eaglets in there. And what I can say is once this nest, from what we know, the plaintiffs that I'm working with in this group, they have done many hours. We think somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple of 100 hours of time data studies where they've gone out and they've actually done volunteer hours out in the field documenting their behaviors over the course of many years to try to understand what their sort of proclivities and inclinations are. And what we know is that every single season for the past 6 years has been a successful nesting season, meaning that the pair was reproductive and that they had success and that the eaglets were able to fledge and ultimately leave the nest and move on to create their own nest elsewhere, except for one season. And in that one season where there was a nest failure, that was a year that coincided with construction that was occurring about 600 feet from the nest. And this was a major residential development. It was close to several hundred apartments as a big apartment complex and all of the things, infrastructure that goes along with an apartment complex. And so that's the one nest failure. But aside from that, they've had great success and again a lot of interest in the local community for these eagles. And that sort of set the stage for the situation that we're now litigating.
Yeah, tell us about that situation. I understand more construction is planned. Maybe it's already happening. Just fill us in.
Yeah, so it hasn't started yet. So in the aftermath of the last project, which they started constructing that in 2013, it took several years for that to be completed. Again, we had the one nest failure, but other than that, we've had great success for this nest from this nesting pair of eagles. And you would think that, after what had happened last time and the likelihood that the construction caused the nest failure, that Fish and Wildlife Service would have been much more reluctant to allow similarly situated construction very close to the nest again. But in contrast to that, when a new developer came in last year, it's a company called Garrett Construction, and they said we would like to build a new residential development. It's 288 units, along with a swimming pool, a parking lot, and other infrastructure that goes along with these large residential developments. Fish and Wildlife Service, accepted their application under the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act for an incidental take permit that would disturb the nest. And without having any public comment, without having any transparency of the decision-making process, only a couple of months after accepting that initial application from the developer, Fish and Wildlife Service issued the permit. Again, no public comment on that. The agency did no environmental review under a statute called the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which is our nation's charter for environmental protection, and it requires federal agencies to at least take a hard look at the environmental impacts of their action, but that didn't occur here. And so after, again, only a couple of months, Fish and Wildlife Service issued the permit, and it allows construction to occur even closer than the last development, which, again, most likely caused the nest failure here. So what we've, we decided this was a situation where we needed to get into court before the construction began to see if we could, get a court to at least force the agency to go back, take a second look at this, at least do some environmental review to look at the environmental impacts and take into account what had happened the last time the Fish and Wildlife Service issued a permit of this kind, and take the hard look that Congress prescribed for these types of actions. And so where we're at this point is we filed our complaint. We got in as soon as possible after the permit was issued. We're in federal district court in Colorado. And we were able to work out with the federal government an expedited briefing schedule on the merits of the case called summary judgment. And we've already filed our opening brief, and the government will be filing their response to our brief next week. And then we'll get a short reply. And then our objective is that the judge who's been assigned the case will rule on this before construction begins.
So these developers knew this was an issue. I mean, they were the ones who initiated the permit process to Fish and Wildlife. I mean, nobody came to them afterwards and said, "Wait a second, you have to stop this." But is that right? And from your papers, it looked like you were